Good morning, everybody. We're here on the farm at Lahaina Poco on the southwest side of Maui, and we're going to talk about worms. I have a lot of people ask me about worms. How can they catch their own worms? How can they trap them from their surroundings? How can they recognize if there are worms around them? What kind of worms are there? What kind of worms are in your environment that you can incorporate in your regenerative farming or backyard gardening or home composting? Worms are really amazing. Darwin, on the very last years of his life, wrote notes on earthworms, and it's pretty amazing. He studied them for many years and realized that they could bring up hundreds of tons of soil within an acre, move it on their own, and bring rock material to the surface and bring humus and leaf material down into the rock structure, which actually breaks it down. And that's what soil is. Soil is basically weathered or eroded rock along with organic material. Earthworms, through the saliva and running it through a gizzard and running it through their system and pulling it out of these tunnels, they have the ability to bond that soil with their saliva and make it stay in the land and hold on to carbon that they've accumulated for centuries. Not only that, it's available for plants to use as nutrients. So the idea of composting with worms comes around from a lot of people making smoothies or making salads and having a leftover material, and they want to use that to perhaps build fertility in their yard, perhaps just to keep their scraps out of the dump. A lot of people have a lot of different reasons for doing it. So when we're talking about worms and what we're going to use them for, there's a bunch of different reasons we use them. We use them in the ground, we can use them under our kitchen sink, we can use them just to deal with some compost, or we can use them on a major level like a forest does to regenerate the land and build fertility. That's what I'm into. I'm into setting up an environment where the worms can move around, where they can proliferate, where they can eat organic material and help reestablish the fungal mycorrhizal colonies underground, allow to have tunnels where there's drainage. So when you talk about composting worms, most of the time people are referring to a red wriggler. Well, what's a red wriggler? A red wriggler could be several different species of worms. It could be a night crawler, it could be Fetida, or it could be Perionyx excavatus. That's called a Waimanalo blue, or a blue worm, or an Indian blue worm. The other one that I called Fetida earlier, that's probably the most common of the red worms. It's got a flat bottom on it. It's not very good at migrating out of its own poop once you've made a worm bin. So those you have to change your medium quite a bit so they don't drown in their own feces. And their populations will go down. The Perionyx excavatus, which I called the Indian blue or the Waimanalo blue, this worm is a voracious eater, but it doesn't like to stay in the bin unless everything is just right. When it does get too much nitrogen and stuff in there for it, and it has too much poop and it doesn't want to swim around in its poop, then it will actually migrate out of the bin. So I learned that sort of by accident, and like, wow, these are leaf litter worms. They'll migrate all over the forest and you can bait them back to an area with food. So the Fetida that's not really going to move around too much, you have him in the main nest, him and her, because they're both male and female, each one. They both get pregnant when they mate, fun fact. So anyway, you have them all in the major pile together. Your long-term worms that if it gets too toxic for them, they're going to leave. Well, guess what? In a forest setting, it's not going to get too toxic because there's deep dwelling worms that are coming up and taking some of that material deep down into the submineral area, going 15 feet down in some cases, and they're leaving permanent tunnels that are now lined with fungal colonies. It allows rain and moisture to penetrate into the ground, which this is really important. So this combination of leaf litter worms, manure worms, and we talked about the Fetida. The Fetida is actually what we call a manure worm. Most people really, I say most people, that's a very generalized term, but when it comes to composting with worms, the general public assumes that's a red composting worm. They don't realize that that's also forest dwelling worms, worms that live deep in the ground. And where did they come from? They weren't composting before. They were one of several different species of worms that live in the forest and in different settings. A manure worm, which is known as the Fetida, the most common red worm, which we spoke about how it likes to live in its colony or not. You can go back to that. This worm is a manure worm. It eats bird droppings. It eats animal droppings within the forest floor. It breaks them down, and then there is a leaf litter worm, which is Perionyx excavatus, the Indian worm. That is known as a leaf litter worm, and it has a horizontal pattern, maybe goes 2 feet under the surface without permanent tunnels. It eats leaf litter into humus, humic acid. Now, our deep dweller worm that goes down and munches fungus out of the subsoils and other things and root material that's dying, he comes up to the top and he spits out all that stuff that he's using to grind in his gizzard on the surface underneath the leaf litter. And now he eats the leaf litter manure and the manure from the manure worms, and he brings it deep down into his tunnels. His tunnels, her tunnels, remember, both of them are both sex. Perionyx excavatus is one of the deep worms we use. And this is known as a Georgia jumper, or there's some other names for them, but it's a really big, fat workhorse of a worm. And the way I've developed my systems, these worms will actually migrate up into your bin and work with the 2 composting worms to create a far superior mineral-rich material. And they will also bring material from the bin back into the ground, which will replenish it and revitalize what's going on deep down below the surface. This mycorrhizal culture and fungal mat that I talk about, this doesn't just creep down on its own. It needs moisture to find its way down there. It needs nutrients and other things. So it's this combination of the micro and the macro working together to build this web underneath the trees so that there's this really incredible interaction between the fungal colonies, the trees, the insects. They all sort of work together to make a healthy forest. So that's my goal when I'm talking about earthworms as much as anything else. But a lot of this can be gleaned and used in your kitchen in a simple composting bin. And that doesn't mean it needs to be one type of worm. It can be all 3 types of worms. You ask me, do I have to buy these worms? Well, in some cases, if you live in a place where they're easy to get, if you live on the mainland, I think they sell them in bait stores. So you can get a lot of these really awesome worms right from your local bait shop. You can put them in some shredded newspaper. You can put them with some wood chips. You can follow some of the rules that we teach you, and you can raise these worms on your own, and you can buy them. So sometimes it's good to buy them. Some places you can't find them. But if you teach yourself on another level and you take it to the next level, you can now go to a forest. You can recognize that there's worms there, and you can set your bins there with the material in it and trap the worms right out of the forest and bring them home with you. If you want to learn about that, go check out our videos on YouTube that are about how to trap your own worms. So once you know an area has a lot of the components that are going to support them, you can basically build a trap, stick it out there in the forest, put some food on it, bring it back in, put it in a layer of your worm composting home bin, and voila, you got it. So we'll probably talk about a little other few interesting things about earthworms. If you like what I'm doing and you like what I'm putting out there, I want to help to create ambassadors of stewardship, to help nurture people back to nature and speak its language a little bit. If you like what I'm doing, check it out on my YouTube channel, go to our Instagram, give us some likes, help us to get out there so that we can share this with other people. I think it's a good time to speak its language. And I came up with this thing, get your worm on, but I don't know if that's it. Maybe support global warming. Check out our YouTube, check out our Instagram, give us some likes and follows, and help us build this up so more people can see it.